Everyone says cannabis expands your mind, but have you noticed that after the high, you're back exactly where you started, sometimes even more lost? What if I told you that what feels like enlightenment is actually the biggest spiritual trap of our time? That the very tool you believe connects you to the universe might be the same one quietly disconnecting you from your true self? This isn't about morality, it's about freedom. Real awakening doesn't need smoke, chemicals, or shortcuts. And the deeper truth is uncomfortable. Cannabis doesn't open doors to consciousness. It builds invisible walls around it. If you've ever felt that strange emptiness after a so-called spiritual high, you already know what I mean. Stay with me, because in the next minutes, I'll show you why cannabis distances you from authentic spiritual awakening, and how to reclaim the power that was always meant to be yours. There's a silent, almost invisible mistake many make at the start of the spiritual journey, believing that an altered state of perception equals expanded consciousness. It looks like the same thing, but it isn't. When someone lights a joint, takes a mushroom, or experiments with any psychoactive substance in search of transcendence, what's really happening is a neurochemical activation that mimics spiritual signals, without the energetic or emotional scaffolding needed to integrate them. It's like jumping straight to the mountaintop without learning to climb. The view may be beautiful, but the body, mind, and spirit aren't prepared to remain there. The brain, in its clever intelligence, interprets these chemical experiences as great revelations. And of course, during the peak, everything seems to make sense. Synchronicity, colors, sensations, the connection with the universe. But what many don't realize is that upon returning from the trance, the mind comes back more conditioned than before. The nervous system reads this expansion as a pleasurable stimulus and, as a consequence, begins to create a subtle dependence, a link between spirituality and substance. That deep meditation that seemed impossible before. Now it only happens with chemical support. That sense of alignment in the chakras, it only shows up under the influence. And then, what should be liberation becomes an elegant prison. There's a delicate point here. These experiences aren't lies. They're real within the field of altered perception. But the problem is that real doesn't mean authentic. The true spiritual path involves integration, not just sensation. We're called to awaken from the inside out, not through shortcuts, but through inner strengthening, which requires presence, surrender, consistency. And to perceive the difference between real presence and an altered state, there's a simple yet powerful exercise. Sit in silence. No music, no substances, no stimuli, just the body, the breath, and the now. That's where the quality of true presence is revealed. Because it doesn't need scenery, smoke, or euphoria. It simply is. This practice shows that legitimate spirituality isn't based on emotional highs, but on balance and depth. It's a journey of self-knowledge, where expansion isn't measured by sensations, but by real inner transformations. Feeling high or out of the body can be interesting, but living with abundance, inner peace, and connection with the universe in everyday life is the real miracle. And that only happens when there's clarity, when there's discipline, when there's a success mindset that doesn't look for shortcuts, but builds a path. Spirituality that leans on chemistry doesn't foster lasting growth. It feeds the spiritual ego, creates illusions of the power of the mind, but blocks the soul's true manifestation. That's why the invitation is for each seeker to question, what am I calling expansion? If it's something that depends on a substance, maybe it's time to look deeper. The universe responds to our authentic vibration, not to artificial euphoria. The law of attraction works when we're aligned with our essence, not when we're numbed. True prosperity comes from inner unlocking, from connection with the higher self, not from dodging challenges through chemical shortcuts. Spiritual awakening is a blessing, but also a responsibility. It demands courage to walk on your own feet with faith, with hope. even when the path is dark. And this is only the beginning. Because when perception is confused with intuition, the next mistake is right there, waiting to be unmasked. There's something especially treacherous on the spiritual path, confusing creativity and euphoria with true intuition. And few catalysts make this mistake as common as cannabis. At first, it seems to open doors. The mind relaxes, thoughts flow lightly, and a kind of mystical clarity takes over the mental field. Many describe this state as a direct connection with the divine, a feeling of wisdom flowing in the form of ideas, insights, even messages from the universe. But what they don't realize is that this lucidity isn't spiritual, it's neurochemical, and that difference changes everything. Under THC, the brain enters a state of dopaminergic hyperstimulation and releases anandamide, the bliss molecule. This generates an intensified perception of the present moment, but not necessarily a real expansion of consciousness. It's like watching a movie through tinted glasses. Everything seems deeper, but it isn't truer. This state creates the illusion of spiritual connection when, in practice, what's happening is a loosening of the cognitive filters that usually separate critical thinking from fantasy. And here the mistake is born. The mind interprets these visions, metaphors, and ideas as spiritual downloads, when in fact they're just synapses partying. A real example is Clara, a holistic therapist who swore she was receiving messages from beings of light during her cannabis rituals. She wrote down everything, drawings, phrases, symbols, but when she reread them days later, she saw only doodles and disjointed sentences. The supposed spiritual revelation proved incoherent, unintegrated, and above all, without practical application. What looked like an abundance of wisdom was actually a collapse of mental filters. And it's not that Clara lacked spiritual sensitivity. She had it. But the excess dopaminergic stimulation made her confuse sensation with wisdom, insight with delusion. True spirituality is recognized not by the intensity of the experience, but by its capacity to generate transformation. A real intuition, even if subtle, has the power to change attitudes, heal patterns, and illuminate inner shadows. A cannabis euphoria, however incredible it may seem, dissipates like smoke and rarely bears real fruit. That's why developing discernment is an essential practice on the journey of expanding consciousness. Always ask yourself, is what I'm feeling applicable? Does it lead me to a greater state of compassion, presence, truth? Or does it just entertain me in a mental theater? Here's a simple but revealing exercise. Write down any insight you have while under the influence of cannabis. Later, in a sober state with a clear mind, read aloud what you wrote. Ask yourself, does this still make sense? Does it bring me closer to my life's mission? Does it promote real inner harmony? This practice shows that not everything that shines in the mind is light from the soul. Sometimes it's just a colorful reflection of brain chemistry, charming but illusory. In authentic spirituality, clarity isn't a fleeting sensation. It's a cultivated quality. It comes from inner silence, from steady practice, from listening to the soul. The true power of the mind reveals itself when we can see beyond appearances, including those created by the mind under influence. And here's the paradox. The more we use cannabis to feel connected, the more we disconnect from our natural capacity to feel, intuit, transform. Because real clarity doesn't need to be induced. It's born from the center of being. And when we don't perceive that, we step into a new subtle territory, the distorted energy field that starts vibrating out of tune, even when it feels light. Energy doesn't lie, even when the words are pretty, the clothes are white, and the discourse sounds lofty. The vibrational field tells another story, and one of the subtlest and most dangerous forms of energetic deregulation occurs when cannabis is used repeatedly within the spiritual quest. Why? Because the plant's frequency, though natural, isn't in resonance with continuous expansion of consciousness. It can open cracks, sure, but it doesn't sustain portals. And when it's insisted upon as a tool for connection, it begins to produce a kind of energetic anesthesia, soft, seductive, yet deeply dispersive. Many say, "But I feel light when I smoke. I even float." Yes, that's true. The sensation is lightness. But lightness isn't always a high frequency. Many times it's just disconnection from the body, loss of grounding. Imagine a balloon let loose in the sky. It's high, but it's lost. That's how the auric field works under prolonged cannabis use. It seems light, but it's unstable. The energy becomes diffuse, directionless, intuition fragments, and instead of entering deep spiritual states, the person floats between pleasant sensations and inexplicable voids, losing the inner compass of their own soul. The signs are subtle. A person starts to forget important things, struggles to maintain focus in practice, avoids facing tough situations in daily life. Everything is softened too much, as if reality were constantly filtered. But true spirituality doesn't filter, it reveals. It illumines shadows, consistently activates the chakras, and promotes balance between matter and spirit. When energy is fragmented, the vibrational field becomes permeable to external influences. The person may think they're more sensitive, but in truth, they're more vulnerable. And this opens space for noise, interference, even spiritual confusions disguised as messages from the universe. The key question here is, does this lightness make me more present or more absent from myself? There's a simple method to detect this, a 3-step process. 1. Conscious breathing, to notice whether the body is truly grounded. 2. Inner silence, to observe whether the mind can stay quiet without stimulus. 3. Intuitive writing, to record inner messages and evaluate whether they come from the soul or from illusion. This small ritual lets you identify whether the energy is aligned with the soul's true frequency or artificially modulated. That's where the difference between authentic expansion and disguised enthusiasm shows up. What many don't know is that cannabis energy acts cumulatively in the vibrational field. In other words, the more it's used, the more the subtle body adapts to that altered frequency. Over time, a person's natural state shifts to dispersion, not presence. Inner harmony is replaced by a floating well-being, but without root, without depth. And without root, there's no real manifestation, there's no prosperity that holds, nor a law of attraction that truly works. Because the universe responds to stable, coherent vibration, not to oscillation masked as expansion. At that point, the seeker starts to ask why they're meditating so much, studying so much, desiring so much, and yet not seeing results. The answer may lie in this energetic fragmentation, generated by a subtle dependence that masks true connection with the higher self. When the soul is scattered, there's no co-creation, only desire without grounding. There's no true abundance, only nebulous dreams. And without that perception, a person can keep thinking they're evolving, when in truth, they're escaping themselves. And this escape, even when it looks like light, is the prelude to a quieter prison, the one where the sacred only happens on crutches. And that leads us to the next point. Few prisons are as hard to perceive as those that look like open doors. The spiritual dependence created by cannabis works exactly like that. It doesn't bind the body, but it conditions the soul. The seeker believes they're choosing freely, using the plant as a tool to expand consciousness. But over time, the relationship flips. It's no longer the seeker using cannabis. Cannabis uses the seeker. It becomes the mandatory key to meditate, pray, feel the chakras, have intuitions. Without the substance, the spiritual experience feels dry, dull, even empty. And thus, without noticing, the aspirant trades the freedom of expansion for the slavery of a chemical ritual. This mechanism is insidious. The mind, crafty as it is, creates noble justifications. It's a sacred plant, Ancient peoples used it in rituals. It opens portals to subtle dimensions. Everything seems coherent, but behind these phrases lives a conditioning, the inability to access spiritual states without a chemical intermediary. It's like believing you can only pray if there's a candle lit or incense burning. The candle and incense can be beautiful symbols, but they should never be conditions. True spirituality is born of raw presence, without adornments, without external supports. Where there's dependence, spiritual autonomy is lost, and with it, the vital force the ancients called prana. And the subtlest detail of this prison is that it erodes will. The person still meditates, still reads spiritual books, still talks about the law of attraction and abundance. But underneath, their decision-making power is being corroded little by little, as if each session under the effect were one tiny thread of vital energy less, drained by chemical automatism. It's a slow, silent, almost imperceptible process. The seeker keeps believing they're transforming, balanced, faithful, but in practice they're handing their power over to habit. This loss of will isn't just mental, it's energetic. The vibrational field weakens, personal magnetism diminishes, clarity wanes, and without clarity, there's no real awakening. A simple example, have you noticed how some can only connect if they smoke first? They say that without it, the mind won't quiet, the body won't relax. That's the clearest sign of the invisible prison. What should be a choice becomes a prerequisite. And when something external becomes a prerequisite to access the sacred, there's dependence. Legitimate spirituality is freedom, the freedom to connect anywhere, anytime, with nothing but yourself. That freedom is the true miracle of expanding consciousness. But it requires discipline, the courage to cross the discomfort of silence without crutches. And it's precisely that discomfort cannabis masks, offering a pleasurable yet costly escape. The invisible prison doesn't show up with bars, but with concessions. Just today, it's only to relax, just to meditate better. But each concession feeds the web. And the more you give in, the more the mind associates spirituality and substance as inseparable. At that point, it's no longer the soul leading the way, it's the chemical habit setting the pace. And when spiritual dependence sets in, true expansion stops happening. Because you can't fully awaken while part of your consciousness still believes it needs something external to connect. Liberation demands courage, the courage to stand naked before silence, to face the void, to discover the universe is already inside. But without noticing, many remain trapped, believing they're free. And this takes us to an even more revealing terrain, the direct impact this dependence has on the spiritual brain. Spirituality doesn't happen only in the heart or the aura, it also manifests in the brain. That's where experiences are recorded, processed, and integrated into wisdom. Without a healthy, lucid, aligned brain, spiritual perceptions become fragmented, incoherent, and often illusory. And that's precisely where cannabis shows its hidden side. It not only alters momentary perception, it also weakens the brain regions most linked to consciousness and spiritual discernment. What looks like expansion, in many cases, is actually a short circuit. Neuroscience has already offered clear clues. Continuous cannabis use reduces activity in the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for reasoning, working memory, planning, and conscious decision-making. If that center is exactly what gives us clarity, how can spiritual lucidity flourish on weakened ground? It's like trying to build a temple on quicksand. The sensation of expansion exists, but it finds no foundation to remain. Result: euphoria in the present, confusion later. Many describe this alternation as a cycle of deep insights followed by forgetfulness, as if the wisdom acquired evaporated at dawn. The hidden symbol of smoke helps explain the paradox. In many traditions, smoke rising to the sky represents prayer, the soul ascending, the spirit in elevation. But when the process is artificial, the smoke doesn't rise firmly, it disperses. That dispersion is the perfect image of what happens in the brain under recurrent cannabis use. Thoughts scatter, intuitions dissolve, and expansion becomes fragile, inconsistent. Instead of a solid bridge to the divine, there remains only a pretty vapor to look at, incapable of supporting steps. Practically, this means a seeker can spend years believing they're evolving when, in reality, they're walking in neurological circles. They feel, but don't integrate. They perceive, but don't transform. They desire abundance and manifestation, but the weakened brain can't sustain the vibration necessary to attract. It's like trying to practice the law of attraction with a mind full of holes. The universe responds, yes, but it responds to the real field, not to artificial sensation. That's why many end up frustrated. They meditate, visualize, but don't materialize. And what's missing isn't faith or hope, but mental clarity to keep energy stable. Science also shows that cannabis interferes with neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to create new connections. If spirituality is, in large part, expansion of consciousness and openness to new thought patterns, any blockage in that mechanism compromises the process. What seemed like liberation becomes limitation. And here's the most delicate point: believing you're free when, in fact, you're increasingly trapped in chemical conditioning. It's as if the seeker were trying to connect with the universe through a broken antenna. The signals arrive distorted, incomplete, full of noise. That's why understanding cannabis's impact on the brain isn't just a health issue, it's a matter of practical spirituality. Without an aligned brain, no expansion can sustain itself. Spiritual awakening needs a physical and mental vehicle able to receive, integrate, and apply. When the mind is scattered, the heart may feel the call, but the body doesn't respond, and without that integration, there's no true transformation. This is the great risk, confusing smoke with light, chemical activation with spiritual revelation. And the more that illusion repeats, the harder it gets to recognize that instead of a temple of consciousness, a false bridge was built. And it's precisely that illusory bridge we need to talk about next. One of the subtlest traps on the spiritual path is confusing ritual with essence. True spirituality is quiet, intimate, almost invisible to outside eyes. But when cannabis enters the scene, it often creates a kind of performative spirituality. Elaborate rituals, circles of smoke, lofty speeches about connection with the universe, all wrapped in an aura of depth that in practice doesn't hold up. It looks like a bridge to the divine, but it's just a staging. The smoke sets the scene, but the spirit remains on the other side, waiting for a surrender that doesn't depend on chemicals. It's common to see entire communities romanticizing the plant as if it were an indispensable oracle. They attribute sacred powers to it, call it mother, and build rites around its use. But they forget one essential detail. Dependence has never been synonymous with spiritual freedom. When an entire group needs the same substance to enter the sacred, that's not communion, it's collective conditioning. It's as if spirituality were outsourced to an external resource, losing its most precious nature, the soul's autonomy. The bridge that should be internal becomes external, and the seeker starts confusing smoke with transcendence. It's worth remembering the lesson of true spiritual masters, those who reached authentic enlightenment. None of them needed substances to awaken. Buddha had no chemical rituals, only silence and discipline. Jesus didn't ascend through smoke, but through radical surrender to love. Ramana Maharshi attained expansion without artifices, simply turning inward to the essential question, who am I? These examples show that the real bridge to the divine is built with presence, surrender, and self-knowledge, not with chemical shortcuts. When spirituality becomes dependent on an external ritual, it loses its essence and turns into performance. The problem with performative spirituality is that it focuses on the set, not the substance. The seeker lights up, smokes, feels elevated, and believes that's expansion. But without the substance, they feel empty, incapable, disconnected. That emptiness should be the starting point of the path, the raw material of transformation, but it's exactly what cannabis masks. Instead of crossing the arid silence, one prefers aromatic anesthesia. Instead of diving into the shadow, one seeks a passing euphoria. And the most dangerous part, all of this looks spiritual. It seems deep, it seems true, but it's just the spiritual ego dressed in ritual. You can see this in gatherings where cannabis is used as a sacred instrument. The environment is beautiful. There's music, there's dance. There are speeches about harmony and connection with the universe. But look in the long run. How many of those people truly transform their lives? How many achieve balance, abundance, clarity of purpose? And how many simply repeat the ritual week after week without seeing real change? The false bridge entertains, but it doesn't lead anywhere. It gives the feeling of movement while keeping the seeker in the same place. It's like running on a treadmill. There's effort, there's sweat, but no displacement. The true bridge to the divine needs no smoke. It's invisible, built in inner silence, in the exercise of faith, in the discipline of the heart. It's a bridge that doesn't show off but supports, that needs no audience, but strengthens itself in the soul's intimacy. This is the bridge that leads to authentic enlightenment, to a spiritual awakening that doesn't depend on artifices. But to cross it, you need the courage to drop the performance and face essence. And that leap of courage can only happen when the seeker realizes that spirituality without crutches is possible and far more powerful. And it's precisely this liberation without external supports that opens the way to the next step of the journey. True spirituality is, at its core, an exercise in freedom. And there's no real freedom when we need something external to access the sacred. Dependence on substances may offer moments of euphoria, but it always exacts its price. The soul loses autonomy. Authentic awakening begins when the seeker discovers they can enter higher states of consciousness without any chemical support. This discovery is liberating because it gives power back to the individual. It's no longer the plant, the smoke, or the chemistry that determines the spiritual state. It's one's own inner strength, one's own prana, one's own faith. The secret to sustaining clarity without crutches isn't complicated, but it demands consistency. It's like training a muscle. The more you practice, the stronger it gets. The same happens with the mind and consciousness. The practice of silent meditation, for example, is simple yet powerful. Sitting for 7 consecutive days in silence, expecting nothing, seeking no visions or euphoria, lets you perceive what real presence is. In the first days, the mind will complain, fidget, search for distractions. But with time, an inner space of calm and lucidity arises that no substance can offer. That's the space where true connection with the universe happens. Natural, spontaneous, lasting. There's a symbol that illustrates this difference well. Imagine 2 flames. The first needs to be constantly blown to stay lit. Any pause in the wind and it goes out. The second sustains itself, steady, firm, illuminating for much longer. Artificial spirituality is like the first flame. It depends on external stimuli to keep shining. Authentic awakening is like the second. It's born within and needs neither wind nor smoke. This inner flame is true abundance, true spiritual prosperity. From it come balance, harmony, expansion of consciousness. And unlike the passing illusion, this light doesn't dissipate, it strengthens. The seeker who learns to cultivate this flame discovers the true power of the mind. They discover that the law of attraction isn't about wishing under euphoria, but about vibrating in steady presence. They discover that gratitude isn't a ritual, but a daily posture that turns any situation into a blessing. They discover that manifestation isn't instant magic, but the fruit of energetic coherence among thought, emotion, and action. By abandoning the crutch of substances, they find the freedom to connect anywhere, anytime, simply by closing their eyes and turning inward. This is spirituality that doesn't depend on setting, group, or chemistry. It's pure, simple, real. And perhaps here lies the greatest gift, realizing that the spiritual journey requires nothing beyond what's already within us. Authentic awakening is less about adding and more about remembering. Remembering we're already part of the universe, that we already carry the divine spark within, that we already have access to the infinite. There are no shortcuts to this recognition, but there are no insurmountable barriers either. All we need is courage, discipline, and faith. And when that path is walked, liberation stops being an idea and becomes a living experience. Because the greatest revelation isn't what we see with altered eyes, but what we can see with the awakened soul. So, now you've seen it. What looks like expansion can actually be the most seductive form of escape. The truth is simple. Real spiritual awakening doesn't need shortcuts. It needs presence, courage, and the willingness to face yourself without masks. But let me ask you, how many times have you mistaken a fleeting sensation for true transformation? How often have you looked for answers in smoke instead of silence? And more importantly, are you ready to experience what authentic awakening really feels like without crutches? If this message resonated with you, don't let it stop here. Apply it. Sit in silence, breathe, test your own energy, and notice the difference. And if you want to go deeper into these truths and keep walking this path of freedom, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and join me on this journey of authentic expansion, because your awakening is waiting for you.